Dave Holbourn, and I ex-Air Force, 18 years in the RAAF. Most of it as a flying instructor, including a couple of years in America, in the United States Air Force as a flying instructor, and then 26 years with in the airlines, Boeing 747s, a lot of that time in training as well, and finished off as a simulator instructor for about 7 years after I got too old to fly, and so I've kept that going, and now I run this Southern Cross Flight Simulator Services in a simulator which can be anything from a Cessna 172 through Arrows, through Senecas, Barons and King Air, in fact.
Sure.
So,
do you know how many aircraft types you've flown over the years?
How many aircraft types?
Yeah, any...
Actually, not that many if you add them all up. So we'll have to use our fingers, won't we? You know, not having a university degree, I'll have to use my fingers. So we start. Chipmunk, don't make me laugh. Chipmunk and Air Force, then Windshield, Vampire, C-130E, KC-135, Boeing 707, TriStar, Boeing 747. Did I miss any? And then my own aeroplanes, Citabria, Nanjing and Arrow.
Beautiful.
So, and they all work the same, you know. You pull back, you go up, you push forward, you go down.
Yeah, funny about that.
Yeah, it's just something you've got to pull a bit harder than others, that's all.
Brilliant. Okay, so how did you get into flying then? What's the story?
The story, yes. Well, how did I get into flying? Well, I immigrated with my family in 1954. I was 9 years old, and from that you can tell I'm not a spring chicken. And we moved to Victoria, down in the Nepean Highway when there was almost nothing there, and living next door to an airline pilot who was flying for, I'm not sure if it was ANA or Ansett ANA, but anyway, he took me, and he was an ex-World War II DC-3 Dakota pilot flying the hump. And he took me to Essendon Airport, which was the international airport at the time, and sat me in something. I'm not sure what it was to this day, but probably a DC-4 or something like that. And the rest is history. That's how it got started.
So you fell in love with flying then? Like,
yeah, I'm not sure, you know, whether I fell in love with flying or fell in love with aeroplanes, to tell you the truth. I've often thought that. But in my teenage years, I had dozens of plastic model aeroplanes, which, God bless my mum, allowed me to have all over the house, things like that. My mate and I built a simulator, a link trainer, which actually had motion. And then after that, I was working in an insurance company, earning the equivalent of what's £6.10, $13 a week, and I was paying $12 a week to fly a Chipmunk out at Parafield, and the rest was the equivalent of $1 for mum and $1 for me. And someone would do the maths and tell me that's wrong, but that's what basically it turned out to be. Under Chipmunks at the Royal Aero Club of South Australia, soloed in September 1963. After that, I decided, because I was working in an insurance company, I thought, well, I really should get a backup. So I got a job as a trainee draftsman, engineering draftsman, which I thoroughly enjoyed. And I was coming up 20 at the time, I think, and a new girl came to the front office, and 6 months later we were engaged. She's sitting right over here, and the rest is history. We were married. I went off to the Air Force and did the Air Force course and came back, and we got married and jumped in the car, drove to New South Wales, and that was the end of that.
How long have you been married?
54 years coming this year. Yeah.
54th anniversary.
54th anniversary, yeah.
Yeah, well,
Yeah.
just touch on the solo bit. So you sold, if you could just say the words like, I soloed this year at Parafield Airport at the Chipmunk.
Right, well, yes, when did I solo? Well, I soloed in 1963 in the Chipmunk. And I remember in the solo check, in the flare, the instructor in the back seat pulled back the stick and made it balloon so that I'd have to recover, which I did. And so he sent me solo. And the silly thing about it, I remember when I was taxiing in, on the interphone I said to myself, I'm a pilot. little did I know that there was going to be a lot more to do before that. So yeah, that was quite amazing. I did spend an awful lot of the time vomiting because I had a bad air sickness problem for a while there. And but anyway, 1963.
Brilliant.
Yesterday.
So then, so tell us about the Air Force. How did you get into the Air Force?
How did I get into the Air Force? Well, I don't know what made me decide to, but anyway, I just applied. And lo and behold, they sent me a letter. I was only looking at it the other day saying, congratulations, Mr. Holbourn, please report here, here and here and do this, this, that and the other, and the rest is history, you know. So that's how it started. And off I went to Point Cook to be a student on the Windshield, big radial engine tail dragger. And as I said before, I had an air sickness problem in the Chipmunk, and the Windshield didn't help at all because it smelt of Dettol where other people had been sick. It smelt of the petrol, the avgas, as you did rolls and it dribbled down the windscreen. It smelt of rubber because we were wearing a rubber mask, not with oxygen in it. That would have been great. This was just for interphone. And I should have mentioned too, in the Chipmunk, we didn't have a rubber mask, we had a throat microphone, so you had this thing around your throat. That didn't help either. But back to the Windshield, yeah, that's a story in itself, isn't it? Because the flight commander my instructor sent me to the doctor because I was being sick all the time.
So every flight you were sick?
Yeah, every single one. Not doing circuits and bumps and the like, but it was all aerobatics and spinning and all that sort of stuff.
So you can just say, yeah, so every flight I went aerobatic wise, I spent most of the flight throwing up.
Yes, that's true. Every flight doing aerobatics, I was being sick. So they sent me to the doctor. The doctor said, you're finished, you're scrubbed, off course. I went back to see the flight commander. My instructor was the flight commander, who was a fantastic guy. An ex-Lincoln pilot, Lincoln being the next one over after the Lancaster. We had him for maritime, complete with his fur-lined flying boots, with his pipe shoved in one and the map shoved in the other. And he used an expletive and said, have you run out of sick bags? And I said, no, sir. And so he made me fly with one hand and vomit with the other. And that was it. So I passed out second last. And off I went down to Pearce, Western Australia, and started to learn the Vampire, which is a very old jet. And my instructor was an ex-RAF exchange and a real gentleman. And anyway, I did much better on the Vampire, and I didn't have a sickness problem after that. So, mind you, in the Vampire you didn't rough and tumble quite as much as you did in the Windshield.
What are your best memories of flying the Vampire?
Best memories of flying the Vampire. I used to love night flying. The instrument lights the panel was all red lights. The big thing in those days to protect night vision. They had side lights and the panels all red. And flying over Perth in a nice clear night, and you're just sort of sitting there with this red panel sitting over the city lights. I used to love doing that. That was very lovely. And the aerobatics were nice. I mean, the aerobatics in the piston were sort of this sort of stuff, whereas aerobatics in a jet, you turn the world around nice and slow. And we didn't spin the Vampire. It was basically loops, rolls, roll off the top of a loop, stuff like that. It was far more gentle. So I went from second last on the Windshields to halfway up on the Vampire. And the boss summoned me one day and asked me what I wanted to fly. I said, Hercules, sir, and he said, thank goodness for that, because you never make a fighter pilot. And so off I went to 37 Squadron, a brand new squadron of C-130 Hercules, to be a co-pilot, and the rest is history. And that was a fantastic place to start learning the business, because after the course, 2 or 3 months later, we were flogging all over the world.
What did you think of the Hercules as an aircraft to fly? How did you?
Lovely, yeah, nice and light, very powerful, and very, very the question was how was the Hercules to fly, and very lovely. And of course the flight deck, being a Lockheed flight deck, was very wide. And you, in the Lockheed aeroplanes, you normally, like TriStar was the same, you go outside the seats to get into the seats, whereas the Boeings you got to go through the middle. And so not only was it very wide, but of course in the Hercules it's like a glass house. And you know, one had a fantastic view of the world, you can imagine. I remember one flight heading up over from Delhi towards northern India, a place called Srinagar in the Kashmir, Jammu and Kashmir, and you know, you've got mountains and it's just, the visibility is phenomenal. Or flying over the desert, and here you are flying over the desert and you look down and you can see the little Bedouin camps, just the little black tents from time to time. Much better view than you get out of a 747 or something of that nature, you know, because you look straight down. Atolls in the middle of the Pacific and all that stuff. Lovely aeroplane.
That would have been awesome. Yeah, fantastic. Do you have anything else you want to touch on with the Herc in that bit, or do you want to then speak about you want to talk about your flight instructor course in the Mackie?
Flight instructor course in the Mackie, yes, I had a fantastic flying instructor, and who was very colourful and insisted that I use colour in my voice, up and down, up and down. And we used to do a duel, and then we would fly with our course mate and sort of teach each other, and then with your instructor again. And I think it was nearly 100 hours. I think it was almost the pilot's jet course all over again. You know, it took a long time. That was at East Sale, and yeah, and I did very well in that. Got the flying prize out of that one. So something I'd like to. I've got a few little pointers to make, and one of them is, if we go all the way back to the wind duel, where what on earth did that flying instructor of mine see in this little vomiting heap of whatever humanity sitting in the other seat, when, you know, in the middle of a manoeuvre I'd say, handing over, and he'd say, no, you know, and he'd make me that. Now, what did he see? And so when I've over the years been doing instructors courses, teaching instructors, say you've got to look past somebody. You've got to, what you're seeing. You've got to look deeper and say exactly. He's looking for potential, and so he saw potential. So from that I went to Vampires, went to the Hercules. 2 years later, 3 years later was it? 3 years later, 2 years later, I was a captain on a Hercules. I mean, who would have thought? And then here I am doing the flying instructor's course on the Mackie and get the flying prize. Who would have thought, you know?
What age did you did you get your first command?
We were married, I was 21, 2 years co-pilot, I think it was, 23, 24-ish.
Okay, so could you say, I got my first command at age 24 on the...
Right, so I got my first command at age 24 on a Hercules. I think we did 6 months internal Australia to start with. The first trip was always Richmond, New South Wales to Laverton, because Laverton was short runway. And so, you know, let's send us to the difficult one to start with. Yeah, and then after that it was worldwide. So Vietnam was on at the time, and so at 25 going into Vung Tau in South Vietnam, where the runway was, I think when they were working on it, 2,900 feet long, 50 feet wide, half PSP planking on sand and bitumen with no markings on it whatsoever. 1 NDB, sand dunes on one end and ship's mast on the other. That's what the equivalent of the Ursa said. So then you came at I can't remember the speed, would have been around about 90 something or other, 100% flap touchdown speed, little or no flare, just, it's where you learn all about aim point, aim point, aim point. That's what it's all about. So yeah, so that was all when I was 25, 26, that sort of...
How did you feel when they told you that you were going to go to Vietnam during the war?
Do you know, what did I feel like about going to Vietnam during the war? Yeah, it's a very good question, because, you know, we were talking recently about how much of a wuss one has become, because if your iPhone signal drops out and suddenly you panic, I can't remember even considering it, to tell you the honest truth. It wasn't even, it was just a trip. you know. We had weapons, sidearms, but they were that we had to sign up, but they were under the bunk. I mean, Vung Tau was a rest and recreation place, so, but it did get attacked from time to time. No, I didn't even think about it. And you know, those of you who've seen the old TV show MASH, the Korean thing, it was so much like that, because you'd taxi in on this pier steel planking, you taxi in, shut it down, and open up, the loadmaster open up the back. Operations would arrive with a US Army Jeep and give me the Jeep, and the co-pilot and the nav and myself we'd jump in the Jeep and tootle off to operations and do our thing, whilst the engineer and the loadmaster looked after loading it, you know. And so after that, we operated out of Butterworth in Malaysia, which, whilst it wasn't a colony then, it still felt like the buildings that we stayed in and things like that were very much the old worldly sort of things like you see in the movies, you know, white columns and fans and all opened up with the sea breeze coming through. Is lovely, yeah. But yeah, I can't think ever. In fact, I know for a fact never considered it being of any risk. Maybe it wasn't, you know.
Oh, that's awesome. So from there, you went to the flight instructor course, which you taught.
Yeah.
And then where did you go after that? Back on the Herc again?
Well, after the Mackie, after the course, went to Pearce, Western Australia, as an instructor. And that's where they had just lost a Mackie, where the student had got himself into an auto rotation at very high altitude. We used to call it up in the thick porridge down here, thin porridge up there. So very little aerodynamic damping, and so he got into this manoeuvre, and I think, as I remember, if you weren't out by 10,000, you had to eject. I think that was the word. And or you started recovering it, something like that anyway. So as a new instructor, the CO, when we got there, would take all his new instructors and take us up for what was known as altitude and compressibility. So we'd take the old Mackie up as high as we could get it, which wasn't all that high for a Mackie really, but anyway, probably high 20s, low 30s, something like that, I don't exactly remember. And he says, right Dave, he says, I want to roll off the top of a loop, and at the top of the, on the rollout, I want a slow roll, I want you to finish with full cross controls. And of course it departed halfway through and auto-rotated incredibly fast. And he said, right now, just put the stick fully forward, and you whack the stick fully forward and stopped. And the heavy bit got to the front and down you go. So that was a very interesting exercise. And then he made me do a spin and patter the spin from the beginning, chatter about going into the spin, what it's doing, look at the speed, and then a Mackie had a tendency sometimes to come out of a stable spin and go into a spiral dive. So all of a sudden the airspeed, which had been fluctuating around the stall speed, would all of a sudden start increasing, and then the G was increasing, and so it slipped from a spin into a spiral dive. And so talking about all that, and then recovered at 10. And then he says, right Dave, now we'll do some advanced aerobatics, you know. And I said, well actually sir, with respect, let's give it away, you know. And he made some comment about transport pilots at that stage. But yeah, I learned a lot, you know, and I might have mentioned back when on the Vampire course, on my formation test, the examiner, straight after takeoff, not very long after takeoff, he said over the interphone, well lad, you don't have much of a clue at all, do you? Which was very comforting. And probably with the Air Force now, probably that would have been it, I don't know. Whereas then it wasn't that important. Again, someone looked through that and said, well, he flies instruments pretty well or whatever, so we'll send him to Hercs, you know. And then here we are, how many years later? Not that many. 5 years later, you're teaching it. And, you know, it's incredible really, so.
So you, from the instructor, the Herc, and then you came to be on the air refueling.
Air refueling exchange job, yeah, with American Air Force, yes, and it was attached to the 509th Bomb Wing at Pease Air Force Base, New Hampshire, which is north of Boston. And we actually lived in Maine, down Maine they call it, which is the last US state before you fall into Canada. So we learned all about snow and ice, which was great. And yeah, and we drove a 1965 Buick Wildcat, which stretched all the way from there back to here, and it belonged to the previous incumbent, and it had 3 sides out of the 4 dinged and patched up with speed tape with a red kangaroo on the bumper bar. Anyway, but that was another time where, you know, we talk about married for 54 years, you know, every one of these little one door closes, another door opens exercise, every one of those, my wife has got to, the schools have to be finished, and, you know, in one occasion the house had to be sold, and quite often she'd do that all by herself, because you get short notice, you go off and do this thing, and she just do it all by herself. And you know, and if it weren't for Diane, my story wouldn't be the way it is, absolutely for sure. If you haven't got the support of your lady, it's not going to happen. So that was amazing. So and we've still got lovely friends in the US. I call them my boss every month. Still, he's getting on a bit now. And so I was instructor pilot on the KC. First of all, we went to Castle Air Force Base, California, and did the course. So we had to do a conversion on the KC-135, which, as you know, is a 707. It's actually a 717. When you go in through a hatch by the side of the nose wheel, up a ladder. Ladder comes down, and you go up there. All very military. And there's a little plaque as you go up there, and it says Boeing Model 717. So that's where the 717 comes from. And so I did the course on that, and the course there was refueling B-52s, which was very interesting. And they're still using B-52s. And whereas where we went to Pease, they had F-111s, FB-111s, the bomber version. So yeah, we learnt that my job was assistant operations officer, and I was in instructor section, so we got involved with lots of touch and goes, which just seemed I got more hours touch and goes, I think, than anything else, you know. And but that was wonderful, and quite a few. We learned a lot, and we got involved with the C5A program, which was just being introduced, refueling the C5A Galaxy, which at the time was the biggest aeroplane in the world, with a huge, great bulbous nose. So that as he came up to what's called the pre-contact right behind you, and stabilised, the boom operator who's controlling the boom is lying on his tummy, and once the receiver was in pre-contact, he'd be cleared in. So if he was 5-1, for instance, he'd say, okay, 5-1, you go ahead and clear the contact. So he'd come in, and he's using a light system on the underneath of the tanker, amongst other things. And then as he positioned himself in the right position, then the boom operator flew the boom above the receptacle and then plugged him in. And the trouble is with the C5 Galaxy and that big bulbous nose, he'd come in and push the tail up and cause you to descend in front of him. So you had to, if you were manually flying, you had to mistrim it, see, like you're pushing forward like so, because when he was in, it was all okay. I remember one night taking, there were 5 of us, 4 tankers, 1 tanker spare, and 2 C5 Galaxies across the Atlantic from Pease, north of Boston, across the Atlantic, halfway anyway, where they had to meet up with another tanker task force coming from Spain. And my autopilot went out. Normally you refuel with autopilot. My autopilot went out, and it's in the middle of the night. And I remember this, I'm trying to fly it with this boom, the C5 Galaxy behind, and I hear the boom operator saying, okay, 5-1, go back to the pre-contact, because you don't want to be messing around in close. Go back to the pre-contact, we'll start again, sort of thing. And I remember this 5-1, that was his call sign, saying, negative boom, minimum fuel, stick it in, stick it in. Anyway, in the end, we gave it away, and we brought the tanker spare over, and he got his fuel from there. So it was 2 tankers for one C5 Galaxy. So he took a lot of fuel.
Imagine you're explaining, so the aerodynamic effect that the Galaxy had on your tanker as it came up underneath, could you explain that to me as if I'm not a pilot?
Okay, so I'm explaining the aerodynamic effects of that big receiver coming in behind you, assuming you're not a pilot. You can imagine, a ship. In fact, when I do the fear of flying program and people are worried about turbulence, and because they don't know what turbulence is, and they say, have you ever been out in a boat, out in the sea, fishing or anything? Oh yeah, so is it ever still? No, well the air's the same, except you can't see the air and you can see the water. So here we are, we've got a boat, speedboat ploughing through the water. What do you see? Big wake, you know. You've seen movies of a submarine going through the water, and you see water coming right over the front and right out the back, just pushing its way through the water. Well, the aeroplane's doing the same thing. So there's this wall of air in front of this big blunt nose that gets under the tail of the aeroplane, and the air pushes it up. And so if it pushes the tail up, therefore the nose goes down and you can descend in front of him.
Beautiful. That's excellent. Cool. There's one other one I was going to touch on. What was the joke that you had with the, back to the instructor? You touched on it, but you didn't tell the joke. You told us it yesterday.
A joke about something?
It was the, oh, that's right, the colour in your voice, the one you said before.
Oh.
Can you tell us that one?
Yes, at Central Flying School, my instructor was quite a character, excellent instructor. And so I'd be in the back under instruction, pretending, you know, I'm pretending to be the instructor and I'm teaching him something and he's sitting in the front. And so off we go and I'm telling him, okay, blogs, the students always blogs. Okay, blogs, put your left hand here and your right hand here now. We'll go through the stall, and what you want to do is go ahead and close the throttle. And no, Dave, no, Dave, no, Dave. Colour in your voice, up and down, make it interesting. So that's what I had to do. Maybe that's how I got the prize, I don't know.
Perfect, awesome, thanks. Cool, that was just one I wanted to touch on. Okay, so you did the air-to-air refueling. Now, were you instructing at this point on the KC-30? So you were giving engine failures?
Yeah.
Okay, could you describe to me, did you ever do VMCA in those aircraft?
No, never.
Could you,
Same in the 7, never. Simulator, yeah, not an airplane. You know,
but in the aircraft you did V1 cuts?
No, in those days that wasn't part of the program. No,
Okay.
you do that only in the simulator.
Okay, but you did V1 cuts later on?
In the 7.0,
Yeah, right. Okay.
yeah, and 7.4.
Okay, did you want to describe that? We'll do it now so we don't miss it later on. Can you describe for me what you would do as the instructor? So, as the instructor in a 707, I would do this and this and this if you could
Right.
describe the V1 cut
Okay.
to a student sitting on the
V1, when I did the 707 course, that was with Qantas, right? So we did the course with Qantas, and my instructor was the fleet manager, and fantastic instructor. So I'd never seen V1 engine failure, which is simulated engine failure at decision speed, basically. And so they taught us that in the simulator, and then we did it in the aeroplane. But if I could just, for instance, give you, and the 7.0 and the 7.4 is the same. So let's just talk a 7.4. So it's a very important, it's not one of those things you just sort of taxi out on the runway and you think, right, okay, here we go, whack, close the throttle. Because it's potentially quite a dangerous manoeuvre, In fact, they don't do it anymore in airplanes, they only do it in simulators. And so what you would do, taxi to the holding point, and we're doing our training down in Hong Kong, Shenzhen, which is in China, with hardly any traffic, nice big runway, so you're all by yourself. So down to the holding point, you say, right, okay, in the briefing, on this takeoff, okay, at or after V1, I am going to take one of the outboard throttles, thrust levers, and move it to idle, okay? I'd like you to just fly the aeroplane. He's already practiced this in the simulator. Rudder is required to parallel the centre line. Don't try pedaling it getting back to the centre line. If you just look right up the end and, you know, don't pedal it. Then when you rotate to this, call the actions and I'll just touch, but we obviously won't be shutting any engines down, right? If anything happens, like we have a real failure, I'll take control and myself and the flight engineer will sort it out. Okay, so, and that's not the end of it, because to be looking at it as we know, I know where the wind is, I know which rudder he's going to be using on takeoff, just for the wind. So I'm not going to fail an engine such that it exacerbates that, so he's going to need even more rudder. So, but I've already figured out which engine I'm going to fail. So he's got his hand on the thrust levers. Approaching V1, call my hand to the thrust levers, and let's say it's number 4, the right outboard. So I will then, after we call V1, I'll say engine failure, and I'll move number 4 about 1.5 inches, not very much. It's not going to go whack like this, just enough to have his feet, and to make sure that his feet are moving in the right direction, that he's putting the correct rudder in. As soon as I know he's got the correct rudder in, whilst monitoring what he's doing with the yoke, because you've got limited roll freedom, you're pulling it back at about that rate to make sure it's all going fine. And once that's fine, that's fine. Because with these big swept wings, 36 degrees of sweep, a tiny little bit of yaw manifests itself as roll. You don't even see the yaw, it just rolls, right? So if he puts the incorrect rudder in, it's the last thing he'll ever do. It is just like this sort of stuff. And I didn't have any adventures in that regard, probably because, you know, I was well taught and made sure it was well briefed, and there you go. And I never ever had an engine failure on takeoff, or even close. It's amazing, really, in 50 odd years of it. Yeah.
How many engines have you shut down or had failed?
I used to do a bit of test, post heavy maintenance test flying in Hercules and 707s, not in 747s, and so sometimes always the post maintenance test flight on a Hercules, for instance, you had to shut down all engines, one at a time, of course. And so you would shut them down and then restart them again, working, of course, with the first officer, the co-pilot, and the flight engineer, running through the checklist. And if it didn't, every now and then you'd shut one down and you'd have a propeller oil light or an RPM out of limits or whatever. So it wasn't that unusual that you came back from the test flight with one feathered. It was really something nothing really, and. So that was that. Engine failures, I didn't have any engine failures in the Hercules. I had a number of precautionary shutdowns, you know, because if you have a oil leak or an electrical problem that you can prove, or a hydraulic leak in the nacelle, for instance, that you could prove, you do a precautionary shutdown and divert somewhere and fix that up. Did that once on the way from Darwin to Richmond, so we tootled into Alice Springs. And when we get Alice Springs, they take off the 2 outboard hydraulic motors, powered all the gear and flaps, whereas the inboards 2 and 3 was their portion of the flight controls. So they just take one of the pumps off there, put it on the faulty one, get a blanking plate and put over and go like that. That was that. KC-135's one, I think, but I was examining someone, so I was in the jump seat. None in the TriStar, 747, couple of precautionaries and one engine failure. But that was top of climb on the way to Taipei. We just shut it down and went back to Hong Kong.
Beautiful. Did you want a break, Dave?
No, I'm fine, thanks.
You're right. Cool. So they're going right.
I like a nice glass of wine.
What are the rules there with simulating? Alright, cool. So, we've covered that stuff. That's brilliant, by the way, Dave.
Is it? Okay. What do you think, Diane?
Very good.
Oh, good. I can hardly see you there in the darkness.
In the sunlight.
She's a hero.
Alrighty, so the one you mentioned that you had a joke about the DME. You said, the running joke was yes.
Well, the DME is distance measuring equipment, right? These days, GPS distance, whatever. The standing joke about flying instructors is they get, spend 99% of their lives bashing the circuit. So once the DME dropped out, they panic. There's some truth in that too, quite frankly. You do get used to your own patch of ground. You'd know that, don't you? You go round and round and round.
Perfect.
So you do it somewhere else and you think, oh, like we used to turn base at Richmond, there was a chicken farm there, you know, and then you go somewhere else and think, goodness, there's no chicken farm, you know, I'll have to, have to work it out.
Oh, that's fantastic. That's perfect. Alrighty, from there, what about the... Let's talk about the night. What did you do? You had some memories of... Oh, what about the explosive decompression in the C-130?
Oh, explosive decompression in the C-130. I was co-pilot at the time, and the CO was the captain. We were out of, I guess we were out of Singapore Changi, something like that. That's before Changi was an international airport. It used to be an RAF base. And it would have been Changi, I think, or Tenga or Seletar. Anyway, and I think we must have been heading up to Vietnam because we were heading north out of there. And then all of a sudden, ka-woomph, and we had an explosive decompression. And it's very interesting because bear in mind it's a very humid environment in that part of the world, and you're instantaneously IMC. Fog so thick, can't see a hand in front of your face. Instantaneously. And so we put the oxygen mask on, and then with the ventilation and what have you, then the fog cleared out of the way, and it turned out that the ramp had not been the ramp door, the bit that comes up, and then there's the ramp, the bit that goes down. The actual ramp, one of the locks was not quite over as it should have been, and it just let go. The ramp didn't fall off or anything like that, it just opened a little hole. That's all you need. When I think we had 19.6, was it, or 17.6 inches of mercury or something. It's very high pressure in the Charlie 130. Held sea level pressure up to about 16,500 feet, so that you could do operations, medical operations in the back. In fact, I had one of those one day. Would you like to hear about that?
Yes.
Wow. Right, so I was on standby one night, and quite late at night, the flight commander came round and said, right, you've got to go to Norfolk Island, and you've got to pick up a kid that's got lockjaw, tetanus, and take him to Sydney Hospital. And so off I went with my good friend as a co-pilot. And anyway, off we go in the middle of the night. Before I went, the CO said, now Dave, have you been to Norfolk Island before? I said, no sir. He said, well, it's a big moonlit night tonight, and you're going to find as you're approaching, the moonlight's going to shine on this chalky cliff thing, and it's going to get your attention so much. Be careful, you could drive it straight into the ground. So anyway, off we go to Norfolk Island, which we find without GPS or INS or anything like that. And anyway, and sure enough, there were these chalky cliffs, and they sure as hell got my attention. And I think I remember, just as I started to flare, Jeff yelled out, flare. and it wasn't much of a runway then, I don't know, and this is a long time ago. And anyway, we landed, we picked up this young fella, I think he was 10, and took him back to Sydney. And on the way, as I remember, I may be wrong, but anyway, I seem to remember they gave him a tracheotomy, because we had a doctor on board and a whole operating theatre type thing down the back, and they gave him a tracheotomy on the way back. Now, and he lived to tell the tale, which was fantastic. Now there's a twist to the story, because as recently as 3 months ago, I thought to myself, wow, I wonder if he's still around. So I got my old logbook out where I've got the paper, clip out of the paper, and it's got his name, hasn't it? So I looked up in the, God bless Google, I looked up and I found the email address for the administrative authorities at Norfolk Island, and sent them an email and said, by the way, I'm he, and is he still around? Next thing you know, I get an email from him. Would you believe? Incredible. So that's good. Well, that's a sort of a, that's like a flying doctor sort of thing. I imagine they get the same satisfaction.
That's fantastic.
Hmm.
That is a very cool story. Okay, what about your landing? with your different ratings of slipperiness, or whatever the
Oh yes, now this is a lesson for pilots, isn't it? We've all been told from day one, beware that wet white or white painted surfaces that are wet after rain are slippery. Be careful. And in fact, when you're taxiing big airplanes around, you really got to go slowly around the corner when it's like that, because if you're slightly too fast, and we're talking about walking pace, almost no more, as the nose wheels turn around, they go on the paint. So you got to be real careful. Well, we'd all been told that. So, but in the USAF, of course, way up there in wintertime, once it snowed, you know, they ploughed the runway and they put salt on it actually, and which always amazed me. But they put salt on it, and we used to have to. We did a duty called supervisor of flying. Our call sign was Foxtrot, and they gave us a little blue USAF vehicle, and we'd drive out. And when the airplane stopped at the holding point, you'd do a drive around them. They'd say, "Okay, Fox, go ahead. You're cleared in." So you cleared in, do it, and they say, "Okay, 5-1, you're looking good. Have a nice flight." The usual thing, you know. And the other thing we had to do was do what's called a runway condition reading check, RCR. Now I don't exactly remember the exact values, but I think 23 was dry, 12 was wet, and 4 was icy. Something like that, you know. Whoever sees this can correct me, but it's something like that. So anyway, so you'd get out onto the runway in your vehicle, which had an instrument in it which was very basic, nothing electronic in those days. We're talking about 1973. So it was, I think it was basically not a gyroscope. Anyway, it was mechanical. So you would accelerate to a certain speed, put the brakes on, and induce a skid. As soon as the skid started, take your foot off the brakes, and the needle would come up, and it was a reading, and you say, okay, the RCR is whatever. And in wintertime, on the runway in places it would be, you know, 5 and 6, and sometimes 4 and whatever, you know. So it was wet and slippery. The interesting lesson is that in summertime, when we'd had rain, you go out onto the runway, onto the piano keys or the big white markers, and do the same test on wet, and it was 4, icy, exactly the same. So there's a lesson there. And the other part of that particular story, which is a similar sort of thing, is rubber on runways, Type A 747. Coming back from Tokyo, landing at Taipei on runway 24. Now the predominant wind at Taipei was that people 99% of the time were using the opposite runway, 06 and 05. And so, okay, so we landed. It was normal landing. It wasn't, you know, you don't hold off for grease jobs and stuff like that. You put it on the ground. You put it on the ground, and then you put it in reverse, and then you would cancel reverse at 80 knots, and you'd start feeling the brakes at about 90, 80, something like that. Well, the runway was only damp, and I remember then feeling for the brakes, but there was nothing there. The brakes just didn't work, and I ended up with feet flat to the floor when the anti-skid started working, which is quite, I would say violent's the word. You notice it because the anti-skid releases the brake on putting them on, and as soon as it senses a skid, it releases the pressure and puts on. And so the whole aeroplane is going like this. And so I did remember that the manual said that once you put your feet down like that, don't bring them back up again, otherwise the anti-skid system has to reschedule itself. And so I just kept them there, and we came to a screaming stop or a lurching stop, I don't remember exactly, 300 or 400 feet from the end of maybe a 10, 12,000 foot runway.
You know how many ton 747?
Well, max landing weight was 285 762 kilos, but it wouldn't have been that. So, you know, 220 tons, something like that. Wow. The interesting thing was, of course, that because it was the opposite runway to what most people use, all the rubber on the runway, and it hadn't been cleaned for a bit, all the rubber was in the first 3,000 feet of the opposite direction. So I roll into the rubber, and having rolled into the wet rubber and the pre-mentioned white paint, yeah, and that's the closest I've ever come to an incident, you know. and very lucky actually in that regard. I don't think, well, it wouldn't have been my fault, but that's not the point, is it? You'd feel that way.
That's fantastic. Alrighty. Galaxy refueling. Okay, so coming up now to the end of your Air Force career, how, if you want to just describe that, you left the Air Force, where were you going, how did that happen?
Right, okay, so as you remember, after the C-130 business, where I was training flight commander, which is flight training manager basically, and so after that, I was a squadron leader, so after that, you either, once you get promoted to wing commander, you either get a squadron, or you go to Air Force office in Canberra. So that's where I'm heading, Air Force office in Canberra. And then all of a sudden the Air Force bought, or the Department of Defence obtained 2 707s from Qantas. No one bought any, I'm sure it's just a paper entry. I mean, Qantas is a government airline at the time, you know. We don't want them anymore, you have them. And so we got these 2 707s, and they let me stay there and fly those for 3 years because they needed a 707 QFI, qualified flying instructor. So once Qantas, we did the Qantas course, which was fantastic, and then we trained our own people after that, you know, and we did some fantastic trips. So some VOP, some just personnel, military personnel, backwards and forwards to Butterworth actually, and some interesting, you know, trips around the world. So that was good. That had to come to an end, which it did, and then off I go to Canberra to the Department of Defence, where I was in operational requirements training. Now I'm a wing commander. They say, congratulations, you can be wing commander, but you can't fly anymore. And so here I am in Canberra fighting, and another lesson here is because I'm fighting about it, and Diane would tell you, you know, I'm complaining. I mean, I had a fantastic flying career. I've flown longer than anybody else, and I'm complaining about it. But what I didn't realise is I was being taught a whole bunch of skills that were going to be very useful coming up. And so they sent me around the world to look to buy a 707 simulator for a start, in company with a Qantas simulator engineer and an young Air Force engineer. And so we went all over the place. And but when I came back, I had to write the report on all these simulators, having test flown them, call people about buying spares and modifying them, etc., etc. Sit down in meetings with people about costing, and anyway, once that came to an end, I left the Air Force and got a job with the department, and I think it was the Department of Transport then, but CASA now, as an RPT examiner, and I was in ground school doing an F-28 conversion, ground school, when there was a telephone call from Cathay asking me if I'd like to come up and be a co-pilot on the TriStar. And so I said, yes, please. And they said, oh, the bad news is, yeah, we know you've got an Air Force instrument rating examiner and all that sort of stuff, but you need to get a civil one. So I had to, in Canberra there, strap on a Seminole and do what was required. And then, in those days, they actually shut engine down, feathered it to do an approach, which I didn't think was very clever, but we did it. And so, yeah, off I went to, this was in September. My whole life stories, September comes up all the time. So off to September to do a TriStar ground school, leaving my lovely wife to sell our first ever house that we've ever, and we'd only had it, I don't know, 6 months or so. Sell the car, put furniture in storage, get the kids all sorted out. December, I think, she came up to Hong Kong. I'd found a house to live in, and shortly after maybe it was the first or second trip, I came back from the trip, there she was waiting outside. She'd gone and got herself a Hong Kong driver's license, and away we went again. And we lived there in that house for 15 years, I think, and we had a lovely time.
That's fantastic.
That was TriStar for, 2 years.
What were your best memories of flying the TriStar?
It was a big learning curve because, I mean, there's only so many ways you can fly any aeroplane, but I don't mean this side of thing, but I mean the procedural, whether you say check, whether you say set, it doesn't matter. But just learning the routes, and I'll tell you what was very, very interesting and quite difficult really was working out descent profiles on your way to be, because now you're looking at something that's got to be cost effective. So whereas in the Air Force we might have got down 15, 20 miles before and pushed the power up, no, we don't want to do that, you know. So we started descent at 100, 110 miles out, 300 knots to 10,000 feet and then 250. And so, you know, you really wanted to slide into the ILS and spool up at, well, I don't know, I can't remember now, 10 miles or something like that. So that was new. And if you knew the radar vectors was going to be more like that rather than like that, that was quite something. And so that was something to learn. And because nowadays it out a computer works it all out. But the TriStar was a lovely airplane, very. And then 2 years after that, the what was he? Director of Flight Operations called me up and said, "Dave, how'd you like to go on the Boeing 747?" "Yes, please, sir." So off I went, did that course, and then I think I did a year on it, and then got the command course, and here we go again. Yeah.
How did you feel when you got told you were going to be flying a 747?
Oh, loved it, you know. I mean, I love the 707. It's just a big 707 with much nicer manners than the 707 has, you know. I mean, the 707, I can remember when up at Cathay, we used to use the 707 simulator, and one of the simulator instructors showed us what happens if you get slow. Now we're talking about old engines, and you can't just go bang with the thrust levers because your compressor still bang, 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 bang. So, and very swept wings, I think they were 36 degrees and all that sort of stuff. So if you get on the end of the back of the drag curve, you know, in your beach barren straight wing and all that sort of, okay, your drag curve might be like that, but these things you sort of fall off the cliff if you get too far on the back. Anyway, and I forget the altitudes, but he'd set it up, let's say 500 feet or something like that. At ref minus 10, well, for a start, you'd be scared you wouldn't see anything like that. You'd be really concerned. But anyway, at ref, I think it was minus 10, landing flap, idle power. Well, again, there's no way in the world you'd select idle power there. But anyway, select idle power and then try to recover, and you couldn't recover because if you pulled back, you got yourself on the back end of the drag curve, it just went down faster. If you open the power levers like that, they're just all compressor stall. The only way out of it is to push the nose down. You couldn't do that because we're at 300 feet already. So your curtains, it's all over. Excellent demonstration. Interestingly, with the 747, it wasn't like that. And the interesting thing is that we always used to marvel at the fact that they did this by bending the metal a different way. Well, I'm sure computers help with the design, but there's no fly-by-wire, no max alpha, none of that stuff. It was just the way they bent the metal, and it was known as a big pussycat. Yeah, it was very, very forgiving and fantastic engines, Rolls-Royce RB211s. We used to say aerodynamics by Rolls-Royce, more thrust.
That's brilliant. That's really good. Cool. So you end up on 747. So can you just mention the fact that you got within 12 months of beginning flying on the 747, you had your command? Could you just say that?
When did I get command after the 747? I think it was a year. Without going back on my logbook, maybe it was 2 years. I got a gut feeling it was a year, I think.
So if you could just say, yeah, so
within a couple of years.
Yeah.
Within a couple of years, yeah. So within a couple of years, I got the command on the 747, and there's a very good lesson to be learnt by aspiring pilots, captains in particular, and not only captains, but managers of all sorts, leaders of men. You know, come this way, I am your leader. Or alas, where have they gone for I am your leader? But in spite of all my previous experience, here am I doing all these line checks to get a command on the 747, and the last one was with a very senior management check and craning captain. And when we finished, he said, well, in fact, I should go back to high-speed descent. We used to ask for high-speed descents, 300 below 10,000 instead of 250, and it was done. That was what was done. It's not done anymore, but that's what was done. And we were going into Taipei, same runway as before actually, and so here I go, and I say to him, ask ATs, please ask for high speed below 10, which he does, and they said stand by. And I remember thinking to myself, because they were a bit late getting back with the approval, and they came back and said, you're cleared. And I remember thinking to myself, I hope they don't come back with an approval now, because it'll be very sporty. And they did, and I accepted it like a fool. However, I mean, it sorted itself out all right, except that, use of speed brakes, and of course, my toes were curled over, his probably as well, and it makes the whole flight deck tense, and it's pointless, to save 40 seconds or whatever it is. And anyway, so in the debrief, and he said, no, it's very good. He said, but we think you'd probably like a few more sectors, and we'd like you to have a few more sectors, and that meant another couple of line checks. Well, on the very last line check, which was into Jakarta, which is known to be quite tricky for weather and various things, and that went okay. And in the walk around there at Jakarta, he shakes my hand and says, well done, Dave, that's it, it's all over. And here comes the words of wisdom, and I said to him, well, we've got a couple of sectors to, no, he said, no. It's wonderful what a difference it makes when a man does what he thinks he should do, not what he thinks everybody else wants him to do. Take command. And so I've taught that ever since. That's a long time ago, and it's very good advice. Doesn't only apply to airline captains either. It's just, any management situation, and honesty is the best policy and all that sort of stuff. If you think that's what you should do, that's what you do.
What year was that?
Oh my goodness gracious me, 1983 plus two of those makes it 85, plus another one's 86, 87, something like that. Well, I flew the Boeing 747 for 15 years. So, yeah, something like that.
Beautiful. All right, no worries. So
prior to GPS anyway.
Could you tell us about, start the sentence with, I was based at, and then tell us about the Kai Tak Airport, which is known famously for its approach.
Okay. So I was based at, operating anyway out of Kai Tak Airport, which we know has a reputation and one thing and another, and which was quite exciting at times. Not as exciting as it's actually made out to be, because in the movies and in the simulators they have you at minimum down amongst the buildings, and you were never down amongst the buildings at all. However, in bad visibility and with a crosswind, it could be tricky, and as you came around the corner, the checkerboard was from years and years past. We were flying an ILS essentially, except it was called an IGS, Instrument Guidance System, and when you got the ident, you got the Morse ident, and at the end of it, it says, this is not an ILS, pilots must turn right at minima. Well, minima was 675 feet, and underneath is a bit above sea level, but not much. Mountains on the left of you, a couple of thousand feet higher, mountains in front of you, a couple of thousand feet higher, so you got to turn anyway. And they had sequence flashing lights going around the corner. So from 675 at minima, you couldn't quite see the threshold yet, but if you just kept the rate of descent going, you picked up the sequence flashing lights, and pretty soon you could see the puppies, and so you followed the puppies down. And one of the tricks, and you use it all the time when you do circling approaches or a base, is not to look at only the threshold, but to run your eyes out along the extended centerline. And there's always, and suddenly it becomes apparent, oh, I've got to get the turn going here, or I've got to back it off, And so that was interesting. I had a couple of diversions out of there, and one of them was after a typhoon. had gone past, but it was windy, but not too bad really. But there was wind shear around, and so as we're coming on the way in from Taipei again, actually, and on the way in we hear people are going round every now and then. Someone's going round, and they're calling wind shear. So anyway, we did the approach, and from the minima around the corner, and it was, you know, it was 8/8 blue. There's no weather. No sooner started around the corner, we got a massive lifting wind shear of about 30-40 knots, and so we clearly went around. We were very unstable as far as approach speed is concerned, so we went around, and I said to in fact I had to talk to ATC, and I said, well, we're going to go to Taipei now. Hong Kong being a hub, when things started, diversions started, everyone ended up in Taipei or Manila or whatever, and because like Hong Kong was the hub of the wheel. Anyway, so we're off to Taipei, and in the middle of this departure, getting a new clearance, you know, radar wants to know, approach wants to know whether I'd like to have another go, and I said, no, thank you very much. We're going to Taipei. So we went to Taipei, and Taipei had 2 parallel runways and another runway which disused, that was used as a big taxiway, plus parallel parking. And this disused one was, and all the parking slots were full. The parallel taxiway was full. Airplanes nose to tail. Anyway, we landed, parked somewhere, and we ended up in the airport hotel, and had a typhoon party, which one did from time to time in the good old days. You had all these crews, all the Qantas crews and God knows what, crews from all over the place. They were all converging there, all with the left hand in the pocket and the right hand around the beer glass, telling each other how wonderful they are, and we are, and I was. And the flight engineer comes up to me with the beer, and he says, 2 great things you said today, Dave. And I said, oh yes, mate. He said, what? He said, well, he said, the first one was going round. And I said, yes, absolutely. I said, what was the second one? He said, the second one is you're not going back there again. And I said, fair enough. So that was an interesting stuff. But that's probably the most exciting thing that ever happened at Kai Tak. It was fantastic. And I did took the last aeroplane, we had 3 airplanes left, and they gave me one of them to take to Chap Black Cock, the new airport, on the night of the closure. Got a nice little certificate. And when we got to Chap Black Cock, which didn't take very long, and we didn't go fast, needless to say, didn't set climb power, set a lot less than that. And when we got to Chap Black Cock and parked, because it wasn't open to the public yet, or limited, airplanes were relocating back there from previous trips. But anyway, but walking through the terminal, it was really, really an experience, strange, because all these seats all covered in plastic, all the benches covered in plastic, new computers covered in plastic, a completely brand spanking new airport, unused, which is really something, you know, to see that.
That would have been really cool.
Yeah. Historic.
Leading up to your retirement, how are you feeling, Dave?
Right, so leading up to retirement, how was I feeling? Not good. And just before I stopped flying, I ended up going up and seeing the Cathay doctor, and I was sitting in his chair having a quiet tear, because you see, for some professionals it becomes it's your life, you know what I mean? And anyway, so I'm having a quiet tear, and he gave me some great advice, and he said, now the thing is, he said, you think you're all by yourself, Dave, you're all by yourself, Robinson Crusoe, you know. He said, you know, he said, I'm lucky. He said, I sit here and I see all your mates come by and sit on that chair, and they all have the odd tear. Yeah? He said, you think you're all by yourself. He said, the thing is with you guys, he said, you don't talk to each other. The women do. Women talk to each other, not the guys. He said, if I went to Sai Kung, which is a local Chinese fishing village, not far away, he said, if I went down there and found a chap and said, excuse me, who are you? And they'd say, oh, my name's Chan Sing Sung, I'm Chinese from the Chan family in Sai Kung, Hong Kong. the doctor said, if I said to you, Dave, who are you? You'd say, I'm Dave Holbourn, I'm a pilot. He said, now the problem is, and we don't know why this is, but up here, it's almost like saying, okay, if Dave Holbourn can't be a pilot, Dave Holbourn can't be Dave Holbourn. And if you're not careful, you can join the ranks of the people that only retire a couple of years and you'll be gone. And so took that on board. Anyway, and when I finished, I actually came back here, and it's very difficult. And the expression, I think the French expression is raison d'être, your reason for being. And all of a sudden, in my mind anyway, you know, I mean, a fantastic family and all that, that's a reason for being in itself, for goodness sakes, you know, far more important than airplanes. But anyway, and I ended up on a radio talkback. I've forgotten how it happened, but actually it was a doctor and a psychologist, and they were talking about this very thing. And they came up with some statistics, which I don't remember now, that a percentage, and it was a large percentage, of professionals, irrespective of age, were gone within 2 to 3 years for that very reason. Anyway, it just happened that 9 months maybe after, so I'm back here in South Aussie, and about 9 months later, Cathay, having said there's no chance of any job doing anything at all, called me up and said, would you like to come back as a 747 sim instructor, and by the way, we need you here this week, sort of thing. That's the way it always works, isn't it? So once again, I left my lovely wife and up I went, and I did that for 7 years. Now, and so even though I was a simulator instructor before, along with being, you know, the normal training thing, all of a sudden, and computers were just starting out really, well, they've been out for a while, but I was a bit anti-computers. All of a sudden I had to learn how to build PowerPoints, write lesson plans with this, not this. And so I was forced into it. I bought a little flat right close to the new airport on the 42nd floor, would you believe? It used to scare the hell out of me trying to clean the window. Didn't bother the local guy that came along to clean the window. He actually opened it up and put one leg outside with a bit of rope tied to the handle on the window, you know. Oh, anyway, so that's another story. But I ended up building my own simulator, Microsoft Flight Simulator, with, in the end, 5 monitors and all that sort of stuff, and I really got into it. At the end of that time, of course, when the 747 Classic eventually went, and I had to come back for good, at that time I had a Nanjing, or Chinese Warbird, and I just finished doing my BFR, biannual review, and my checker was CFI at the Uni SA Aviation Academy. And he said, would you like to come up and teach instrument ratings? And so I said, yes, please. And so I did. And so then so that's now 12 years ago, and I was introduced to GA then, instrument rating courses and the like. Subsequently, about 5 or 6 years ago, I think it was, they outsourced to FTA, and I contacted the government, said, could I buy the simulator? And I contacted CASA and said, can I set up in Gaul with the simulator and do instrument rating proficiency checks, the simulator part of it, and teach courses and all that sort of business. And I have to say, CASA have been and still are incredibly supportive of the whole thing. They're fantastic. And and the rest is history. So we brought it down here to the hangar. It used to be over the other side there, and then I had a Piper Arrow IFR, and about 2 years ago I decided to sell the Piper and upgrade the simulator. The core of the simulator, the core is actually the same one that was at the uni, but now it's been extensively modified, new computers and the new 220-degree wraparound visual, which is, I think, as far as I know, is the only one available in South Aussie for people to use. And much as I miss that old life, I've got a new one. And now I've got a new raison d'être, yeah? And I've been able to, I offer, how much is it? 8 scholarships, I think, through the Honourable Company of Air Pilots and Navigators, through command training, and 4 of those are complete courses, and 4 of those are IPCs or recency sort of stuff. So because I'm finding now, especially with this lockdown, I'm finding I'm getting ex-FTA and others, young people who have finished a course, are in great debt, finished a course a year ago, 3 years ago in one case, don't have much money, and it comes to IPC renewal time, so they come down here and do it on a single instead of a multi-engine aeroplane. So I really enjoy doing that and helping them in that. I also do with Flight Experience Adelaide a Fear of Flight program, which is incredibly satisfying, and also airline preparation for young people going to airlines to have to do a simulator check with the airlines, because in the last couple of years at Cathay, I actually did the same thing with them, conducted the sim check, and then sat on the selection board. So I don't know all the answers, but I got a rough idea what goes on. So I've got a new reason for being, and as far as I'm concerned, you know, I'll just keep doing this, and I thoroughly enjoy it.
Yeah, excellent. That's really good. Do you want to just talk about your son Chris now?
Oh yes. Oh, my lovely son Christopher John. He was well, he's with Cathay now as a senior captain on A330s and A350s, when he first came to Cathay Pacific, after he checked, he was on the 747-400 for a while as a second officer. When he came to the Classic, they wouldn't let me do any of his training for obvious reasons. But we first flew together in early days out of Chet Black Cock, and I got to tell you, and we went Taipei Tokyo, and I think, and the first radio call came out from Tokyo, there's this puzzled look in my direction as we saw it, but that was great. I mean, it doesn't get any better than that, quite frankly, and so yeah, we're very close, and we like exchanging stories, and that's Chris. So he's up there in Hong Kong. He's not doing very much flying at the moment, and you know, fingers crossed it'll all go better soon. But my little boy with corduroy jeans and blonde hair and everything is 52 now, and I don't know how that happened. There's got to be a mistake, isn't there? It's all your fault.
Yesterday you said, Dave, you used the words, "If I can help some young people along the way," was your quote. Are you able to roll that into a sentence for me?
If I can help some young people along the way. Well, I mean, I've had an absolutely charmed life professionally. As someone has said, it was like Boy's Own magazine, you know. I mean, I haven't had adventures like people shooting at me, but man, I mean, every part of the earth from the top to the bottom. No, that's not true. I haven't been to the Arctic and the Antarctic, but the other way around. And it's been fantastic. So now, you know, it'd be nice in the remaining years where I can be of some influence to give something back. Now I've done a little bit of, I don't know if you would call it mentoring, but I've helped a couple of people into various airlines. Firstly through the airline preparation thing. I remember one in particular. I think his chap was trying to go to Air New Zealand, and I'm sitting in the car. They're up there at Parafield, and I get a telephone call, and he said, Dave, I'm in. And I don't know who got the biggest kick. I think I did, quite frankly. And that's lovely. And the fear of flight thing, you'd think, well, you'd probably think of a stereotype, someone that's frightened of it, but you'd be wrong. I'm not even going to say what the stereotype would be, but it's all the way from mid-30s businessmen to grannies and everything in between, professional people, whatever. And Diane will attest to this every now and then, and I used to do a lot of it before the COVID thing. There was a lot of it going on, And in fact, that's something you've got to remember as a pilot, quite frankly, and we were always very aware of it. There are a goodly proportion of people down the back of the aeroplane who do not want to be there, who do not know how it stays in the sky, who are terrified of turbulence, and so, you know, it's worth remembering that. But anyway, as Diane would attest, I've had a couple of calls in the middle of the night from, I don't know, Rome or somewhere, you know. Oh, hello, Dave. Yeah, I just want to tell you that the flight was great, and I'm at the airport, and I haven't had any alcohol, and you know, it's been wonderful, and that's very, very rewarding. The other thing I've helped a few people with is decision making, and we had a decision making model in Cathay called the CLEAR model: clarify the problem, look for alternatives, etc., etc. Evaluate, act, stop talking, act, and then review, because in the end, whatever's happened, you go back to because it was actually for sorting out complex engineering problems in the flight deck when you had a malfunction. Because sometimes you can have a malfunction, you think, oh yes, that's what, but that isn't the problem at all. The problem's over here and that's causing this over here. So CLEAR works very well. It also works extremely well in everyday life. And so there's that one, and Benjamin Franklin's one, I think it was, where you draw a line down the middle. On the left you put the pros, on the right you put the cons, and you grade out of 10 each of the things that you know thinking, and you add it at the bottom. And we all think, when we're worried about what you're going to do next and the consequence, we all think it's so close, and oh, if I go, but actually when you add it all up, I've never seen one close. Every single time it's like this. And so on the whiteboard, I'll get, I'll help people with that, and that's helped a few times. But I know a couple of people now in the Air Force, and which I still recommend to young people. I still think the Air Force is the way to go. So those sorts of things, yeah. So if anyone wants to come and talk about decision, they can't make up their mind what to do. It doesn't cost anything. Come and have a chat. A cup of tea's always available, and that's about it.
Brilliant. And last thing we'll go through is just what services you offer at Southern Cross.
At Southern Cross, the services I offer. Okay, cup of tea or coffee. A smiling face. Courses, private instrument rating, and instrument rating, the simulator part of it, 20 hours worth there before you tootle off to Murray Bridge to do the flying in the actual aeroplane. And also for instrument rating, IPC's instrument rating proficiency checks. I just do the simulator part, and then you tootle off and do the flying part in an aeroplane. I'm very much aware that it's an unpleasant experience. It always is, it always has been. It doesn't matter how senior you get. In fact, the more senior you get, the harder it is. Because if you're a line pilot, for instance, and you have a bad day, okay, unless it's extreme, if you have a bad day, they say, okay, well, we'll give you a bit of training here and you go and do another one. If you're flight training manager 747 and you have a bad day, you probably won't have a job the next day. So the consequences, well, you wouldn't have any credibility. And when you're in the simulator getting your IPC, you have one of the guys that works for you, one of your checkers that works for you, doing the check. You've also got a first officer watching, a flight engineer watching. You can't let you get away with anything. Yeah? So in that regard, it doesn't get any easier. Now, there are standards, and I insist upon the standards. Most people come here and do a couple of hours of practice before they do the IPC. Most people on the day of the IPC come and do an hour of solo all by them. And sometimes they come out of the simulator and say, Dave, do you know something? I'm not doing it today. I said, it's fine, whatever. We just cancel it. There's no problem. Come back another day or whatever. But I'm very much aware that the standard is required, but I'm not going to sit there at the other side of the desk for 2 hours and quiz you on my favourite questions, like I know more than you sort of business, you know. And in fact, I don't charge for that at all. The ground component exactly follows the test form. There are about 11 or 12 things. We talk about that beforehand, lead you to the books, and I've got it all set up on a PowerPoint presentation. So it's a structured thing, the ground component. And at the end of it, I always say to someone, did you enjoy that in a whoop sort of way? and people are probably being polite. Say, well, oh yeah, well, learned a bit. And I think, well, that's what it is. It's supposed to be it's a discussion, and there's things that come up that you don't know, and we talk about stuff. And as CASA senior examiner said to me a couple of years ago, he said, Dave, you can always tell when someone's been in the books, and you can, and that's what it's all about, So that's what I do.
One last one for you, Dave. What's the advantage of the simulator? You used them in the Air Force and the airlines. They're not used as heavily in general aviation. What's the advantage of the simulator?
Well, the thing with the simulator, of course, and is that you can stop it, and especially when you've got visuals like this and the realism like this, I can sit there, you can take off, dum-de-dum-de-dum, off we go, and something's not going quite right, so I can say, just a minute, boop, freeze. Now, if you look at this, with colour in my voice, if you look at this, you can see that, and over there that's going in. Now look at that attitude there, which was supposed to be about 10 degrees, it's -2 degrees, so guess what? That's why we're going down, So you've got to keep an eye on that. Okay, another go? Right, here we go, unfreeze. So you can't do that in an aeroplane. You can also reproduce some very low weather minimas, and low weather minimas and an ILS comes to mind, because the visual segment of it is as much the approach as the bit that the actual instrument flying bit, and you can practice that, and you can reset it, and you can do it 10 times, and of course at the end of that, it's a lot cheaper, and safer, because we're probably not going to kill ourselves in there. You never know, but probably not going to kill ourselves in there, and. If you were to go and do all that in a Baron, for instance, it's costing you $800 an hour. You come and do it in here, it's $150 an hour. It's a big difference, So it's safer, less expensive, and I think in the end produces a better result, because, as I say, you can freeze it, you can target your teaching and do a certain aspect of it. That's about it. I think they're the benefits.
Beautiful. I think they'll do